Minister, respite and short break services play an essential role in supporting family carers and people with disabilities. Yet, 3/4 of families get no respite at all. There is a significant level of unmet need in terms of respite care, with less than 5,200 people receiving a respite service in 2022, despite there being an estimated 20,000 people or more with an intellectual disability, physical and sensory disability and autism living with family. Less people received respite services in 2022 than in 2018, when more than 6,300 families were in receipt of respite care. Fewer than 1 in 4 people with an intellectual disability living at home with their family received any form of HSE-funded respite service in 2017, and only a third of adults, and the overall level of service provided has decreased, with only 120,000 overnight respite sessions provided in 2022, compared with 160,000 in 2019. And all of that is a disgrace when we consider that we're dealing with people with profound disabilities and their families who are not being properly supported. And if that wasn't bad enough, Minister, we've also seen in recent months and in recent years closure of respite services. We've seen closure of services in Cork, in Wexford, in Donegal. Many of these closures have been raised on the floor of this House time and again, and yet we haven't seen those services restored. And they have literally left hundreds of families with children and adults with disabilities without essential respite care. It's a fact that as we sit here today, Minister, only 15 respite beds are available for children with disabilities in Cork. And for me, that's absolutely unacceptable when you consider the size of the county of Cork. This government has failed to halt the closures of respite care centres during and since the COVID-19 pandemic, and you failed to properly support the sector. You failed to train enough professionals, you have failed to retain enough professionals, and you have failed to expand its workforce and develop the sector. One of the key problems and the key challenges we have in providing respite care and keeping respite services in homes open is a lack of staff. We don't have the staff because we haven't had any level of significant increase in training places and capacity to ensure that we have the pipeline of graduates that we need to provide these services. And the fact is, Minister, that your government is failing people with disabilities. You're failing people who care for them and their family members. The Disability Capacity Review was published a number of years ago. It set out in clear and concrete terms what was needed in terms of capital infrastructure, human resources in terms of staff, and what the needs of the population of people with disabilities are across a whole wide range of areas. In our alternative budget last year, we funded that multi-annual plan. The government hasn't done it. You produce all of these plans, or at least the HSE does, and then there's no time frames. The funding simply isn't there. It's all piecemeal, a little bit here, a little bit there, but the actual plan itself then isn't properly funded. And who's failed in all of this, Minister, are children with disabilities and adults with disabilities who should be getting respite care. And their families really need it. Anybody who knows anything about supporting somebody with disabilities and what families go through know that respite care is so badly needed for those carers. When we see respite beds closed, when we see that the capacity isn't there and only 1/3 of families are actually getting respite services, what we see behind all of that are real people who are being failed. And I know from talking to many families of children with disabilities and adults with disabilities, it's a real difficulty and a real challenge. They love their loved ones and their family members. They will go to the ends of the earth, as we all would, but it's very, very demanding and really challenging for those family members. And all they ask for is that the government provides the service that they need, the respite services. So when we hear of bed closures and a loss of services at a time when demand is increasing, then I'm sorry, Minister, but I have to place the blame and the responsibility for that at the door of your government. And I know that you're a minister that works hard and you're a minister that fights your corner in relation to your department, but I think even you would have to accept that the level of investment that has gone into respite services is unacceptable. The fact that we don't have a resource and a time frame and a plan to deliver the capacity review is also a disgrace. And the fact that we have closures of services in Donegal, in Cork and Wexford and elsewhere is also a disgrace. So more needs to be done. You're the minister in charge. but we need a whole of government approach, including the Minister for Health, to ensure that the recommendations we have in this motion are implemented.
Respite plays a key role in supporting family carers and providing a good experience for the person with a disability. And it can help prevent or even at least delay full-time residential placements, and it preserves the family unit and supports family stability. And I mean, it just reminds me, I was speaking to a person in my constituency who was looking for respite for a long time for his daughter, who has quite complex needs. And he said they were at breaking point, absolutely at breaking point. The daughter didn't sleep much at all. They were awake most nights of the week. They were actually in crisis mode before they were offered respite. And he said it has made such a difference to their life in that their daughter's getting regular respite every 2 weeks. But why wait until the family's actually in crisis mode before offering this vital support? I mean, as it was pointed out to me by many, issues like this, where the supports aren't provided, breaks marriages. It causes mental distress. Even today, I attended the MS pre-budget submission in the AV room, and you were there, Minister Rabbitte. And on that, it states that 64% of caregivers are emotionally drained, 32% experience depression. And we know 500,000 people provide care in Ireland, and they do so much unpaid work, and we all recognise the crucial work that they do, but they don't need a pat on the back and be told how wonderful they are. They need the active support on the ground, such as respite, which will make their job bearable and make them stronger to be able to provide the care that they need to provide for their loved one. I've also raised the issue before of my own area of Cavan. I mean, there's Annalea House in 𝐥𝐢𝐬𝐭𝐞𝐧𝐢𝐬𝐬, which provides respite for adults and children from Cavan and Monaghan, and Steadfast House in Monaghan, which provides adult respite as well. When Annalea House was closed, there was another house provided, 𝐥𝐢𝐬𝐭𝐞𝐧𝐢𝐬𝐬. Why was this house not kept open? I've asked this before. I've asked the HSC. They've told me that they weren't provided with the resources to keep it open. By resources, I presume they mean staff. If I could get an answer on that, it would make such a difference again if there was one house providing respite for children and one house providing respite for adults instead of a week about. It would increase it majorly. And so there are numerous reasons why families apply for respite, and there are different types of respite that can be provided, but it's important that it is given.
Thanks very much, 𝐥𝐢𝐬𝐭𝐞𝐧𝐢𝐬𝐬. I want to commend my own colleague, Deputy Tully, in relation to this area. As our spokesperson on disability, she's done huge work in this area, and I also do want to acknowledge that you're here yourself, Minister, and I know that you are passionate about this as well, but we do have to highlight when there's failings. As my colleague, Deputy Cullinan, has said, we have to lay that at your door and at the government's door. I'm specifically going to speak about services for children this evening in the short time that I have. I think that we know that a lot of families get to a point where they consider residential care not because they want it, but because they get to breaking point and they don't see an alternative for them. And respite, and the families that I am dealing with and that we are all dealing with, they're looking for such a little amount to begin with. People are coming in looking for maybe one overnight, maybe one day in a space of 2 to 3 months. They're not big asks, and I would say that it's after housing in the constituency office, it's the #1 query that we deal with, and it really can make such a vital difference to families and specifically to children, that they get to stay in their own home, surrounded by their families, surrounded by their community. Whereas it gets to a point sometimes for families where they look at residential because it's at breaking point. In Carlow and Kilkenny in particular, I would say access to disability services is patchy, and that's putting it nicely. We have a situation in Carlow, for example, where there is 23 full-time positions and only 10.5 of those are filled, which I'm always amazed at exactly how a half a position can be filled. How can you have a half a person? But I just want to stress that access and respite on a regular basis can mean the difference between a person remaining in their home. As I said, out of sheer exhaustion, sometimes families look at residential services. I'd also briefly like to mention in the time I have remained in July provision, the programme is an absolute godsend for parents. It did undergo a recent change in eligibility criteria, which I think has put the programme under serious pressure, and this was highlighted in depth at the Autism Committee. I'm concerned to learn that many schools are opting out of the programme due to a range of issues, and I think we really need to try and do something, particularly in relation to staffing, and I would encourage the Minister to ensure that schools are ensuring children with the greatest level of need can access that programme, because again, that's another vital service, and again, it's children that we're failing, and we should be doing absolutely everything we can for our children to reach their potential.
And there is no doubt that carers and families have been failed right across the state and failed for far too often. And I commend the fact that Deputy Cullinane has tabled this motion today, because these parents, these children often find it difficult to have their voice heard, because we know respite services isn't a luxury, it's a necessity, as has been said here earlier on. It's what families need to maybe attend a funeral, to attend a family wedding, to simply have that break, to be able to recharge so that they can provide that vital care for their loved one in their home the rest of the week, the rest of the month. And that type of support, the respite support, prevents out-of-home and full-time residential placements that would otherwise be required if it wasn't for it. But these families are being failed over and over again. And in so many metrics, it's very clear that the government is failing. It's failing on the assessment of need, it's failing on the delivery of services, and it's failing on the issue of respite care. There is a growing unmet need right across the state in terms of respite care. You can see that fewer people received respite services in 2022. Fewer people received it last year compared to 2018, nearly 20% less. And this unmet need is a failure of government to support carers and families, and it's happening in my own constituency of Donegal. I've been in contact with a mother who has a number of children who are waiting for respite services in Drumbo House in Stranorlar. She's 3 children that should have the respite service there, but those 3 children for 3 years have not been able to get that respite service in that centre. Why? Because it is closed now for that type of service. We've had assurances from the ministers 2 years ago that this recommencement was in hand. I was recently told that Drumbo Respite Centre will not be reopened until the end of the year for respite services. We still have a situation where the 7-day respite service in Seaview House in Mount Charles is not being delivered. I raised this issue with the Minister 2 years ago and again was told that expanding this service to 7 days a week was a priority. 2 years later, Seaview House is still operating, not in a 7-day service, but in alternating between a 5-day service one week, 4-day service the other week, and never on the weekends. It's not good enough. Families being failed over and over again, and this needs to come to an end. 𝐥𝐢𝐬𝐭𝐞𝐧𝐢𝐬𝐿.
𝐥𝐢𝐬𝐭𝐞𝐧𝐢𝐬𝐿, and I want to thank my colleagues, Deputies Cullinane and Tully, for bringing forward this motion and giving us the opportunity to have the discussion here this afternoon. The Disability Capacity Review, Ministers, shows a massive shortcomings. 3/4 of parents caring for an adult or child with an intellectual disability have received no respite whatsoever. Now, respite is not a luxury. It's not something that, it's not an optional extra. It's what these families need, and these parents, it usually is the parents, need just to be able to keep going, providing the care for their loved one. And when you talk to people who are waiting on respite and just left, they tell you that they feel like they've been forgotten, like nobody is listening to them, and like so long as we're stuck at home, then, you know, we can't go out and protest. You're not going to see us on the streets. The government don't care. They're not listening. They don't understand. Now, I fully appreciate the commitment of the Minister to resolution in this area, but it has to be matched with people, it has to be matched with a plan, and it has to be matched with services that actually deliver for the parents, the guardians and the carers who are doing a massive service to the state every single day of the week. And I've said this on more than one occasion. If they were to ballot for industrial action, they wouldn't be on strike 10 minutes before they will get your attention. They don't want to do that. They love the people that they care for. It absolutely guts them to have to go into their local TD's office and beg for services. They don't want to have to do that. I spoke recently to a family with a 16-year-old, and Minister, you're aware of this case because I flagged it to you. He suffers with anxiety. he hasn't had respite. He is now looking at having to go into full-time residential care for however long that's going to be. His family are absolutely exhausted. He's 16 years of age. He's in an acute hospital bed in Crumlin. He shouldn't be there. He doesn't need to be there. He doesn't want to be there. There's somebody else, and his family know this, there's somebody else who needs that bed. He needs to be in respite or in full-time care. This is, it's not hard to join up the dots, but the people who are stuck at the business end of this are the carers, and they do feel abandoned, they do feel forgotten. So, Minister, please match your words with action. Thank
you very much. Deputy Martin Kenny.
Minister, respite is a serious issue across the entire country, but I've been engaging with you for the past 2 years in relation to the South Leitrim problems that we have there and with families there that are trying to get respite. And in fairness, you came to a meeting in Carrick-on-Shannon, met the families, met all the stakeholders. A group was put in place to build a facility in Carrick-on-Shannon. Work on that has been at a glacial pace. They meet every month, and nothing has happened from the previous month, and nothing happens from the previous month, and there is huge frustration with the time it's taken. We understand now, almost a year later, they're finally getting to a stage where they're going to appoint an architect, and they have the site. You know, it's just crazy how long everything seems to take. We also, of course, had the possibility of an opportunity where Clonmahon House, which was in Sligo, where there's 2 purpose-built bungalows, built for people with disabilities, which have the rails, which have the full accessibility, have been decongregated. And one of them is empty, and the other one has 2 people in it. And there was an opportunity for to use that. And that has not been used. And I still hear that the plan from the HSE is to turn them into office space. And I know I said here in the past that the person that done that should be fired. You know, I still feel that the person who would do that, who would think that that is appropriate. And in actual fact, those buildings that were built, families went and raised money at the time, 20 years ago, to build them, to put them in place, for their children to have services. And they were put there as residential services. Now no longer used as residential service, but they're quite appropriate to use as respite services. But the problem seems to be that the HSE doesn't want to do any of this work themselves. They want to ensure that all of it is done by other agencies from the outside, private sector. The option which was put in place recently has been the option of respite services in Boyle and County Roscommon, which again has been provided by a private provider. We're months and months waiting. That is not up and running yet. So, Minister, I appreciate your commitment, and I appreciate that you're doing your best, but clearly your best is not going to be enough to move whatever is the obstacles that are in the way here. And there are serious obstacles to try and ensure that we get services delivered for people across the entire country, but particularly these families in South Leitrim that are still waiting 2 years on. The promises we made in Carrick-on-Shannon have not been fulfilled. And I would appeal to you again to put the pressure on to make sure that we deliver on that.
Mr. Ryan, please.
Minister, I wish to speak on behalf of approximately 500,000 family carers who are tirelessly providing indispensable at-home care across the state. Unpaid, these unsung heroes save the state billions annually through the care they provide for their loved ones, all without receiving the support they not only need but rightly deserve. However, HSE Essential Respite Services, a vital lifeline for our family carers, are in crisis. This crisis manifests itself in prolonged waiting times, stark geographical disparities in service availability, and in some places a complete absence of support services. To illustrate, within my own constituency of Kildare South, an 89-year-old woman caring for her 55-year-old disabled son struggles to receive any form of assistance or respite for her son. Imagine being 89 and you're trying to lift your son up and you mightn't have a hoist and you're not getting housing adaptation and there's no services coming in and you're getting no respite. That's absolutely disgraceful. This crisis is further compounded when you consider respite services intended as short-term relief being occupied by long-term residential cases. We haven't even touched upon these caring under the radar. Those who keep caring to themselves, who know they will not have any form of support at all. The situation calls for significant investment to ensure a fit-for-purpose statewide respite service that duly acknowledges and supports our carers. Concurrently, the Government must invest substantially in our residential care facilities to keep pace within population growth and future-proof our systems for projected demand. Last year, in the Sinn Féin alternative budget, we pledged to funding for an additional 5,500 respite hours. The Government has thus far failed to match it, and Minister, it absolutely shows. Ultimately, Sinn Féin would endeavour to give family carers the support they deserve for their selfless and invaluable contributions to our society. So, Minister, I'm urging you to help and do something here. Thank you, 𝐥𝐢𝐬𝐭𝐞𝐧𝐢𝐬𝐭.
I don't have long, so I won't delay. A mother in Tipperary is caring alone for her son, who has a very specific needs, including an uncommon disease involving abdominal deficiencies alongside ASD. In the past, she's had to cancel her own appointments because she cannot find anyone suitable to look after her son. The typical response that we are all used to hearing when we inquire about people in this situation is that there are insignificant respite replacements available to meet demand. But this response went further. It told me that a significant waiting list exists for respite assessments. So not only are people delayed in getting respite services, there are delays in getting respite assessments. Do you know the words that parent used to describe to me in the office about how she feels and how she sees the system that is failing her? Dire and chronic. And of course, loneliness was a feature of that conversation. I know what else is making the problem worse for this lady and for the many other people out there in a similar situation, that home care hours are just out of reach for so many as they are for her. I submitted a PQ on home care hours for North Tipperary, the 𝐥𝐢𝐬𝐿 area. While I haven't received a reply to that yet, I have received a reply for the 𝐥𝐢𝐬5, which includes South Tipperary. There are 1,003 clients awaiting home support hours in the South East Community Healthcare area. People whose lives are at their most demanding are being failed. Yet at the same time, communities are witnessing the removal of local beds and services with the excuse that it's been done to improve care in the community. It's illogical. When St Bridget's and St 𝐥𝐢𝐬𝐭𝐞𝐧𝐢𝐬𝐿 was closed by stealth, 16 beds, 3 palliative, 2 respite and 11 convalescent beds went with it. How is that serving the community, Ara? This response to that was to farm the respite beds out to the private sector in your ambition to gradually privatise essential health and social care services, and to send those in need to the other beds outside of their community. Ara, you'll know that we're keeping a steady eye on your plans with the CNU in Cashel and the unanswered questions regarding respite beds in the Dean Maxwell in Roscrea. Given the underhand way you have treated health facilities in Tipperary, there's a lack of trust in you down there. And the fact that we're discussing this motion here today and the potential need for around 20,000 additional respite hours is a testament of your failure. You thrown the disability capacity review out the window. And in government, Sinn Féin would implement a multi-annual strategic workforce plan to expand services to address the extreme levels of unmet need and leverage all existing capacity in the sector to support the reopening of closed respite centres. And while you're not opposing the bill here this evening, actions actually speak louder than words, Minister. So stop closing down these beds. And also, to finish with, you're continuing the efforts to make a real meaningful difference in the lives of people with disabilities. You're pulling all the services out to local communities and moving 30, 40 kilometres away from their families. 𝐥𝐢𝐬𝐿.
I want to commend my colleague Deputy Tully for her tireless work on this issue and for those with disabilities. Family carers have been held up for a long time as that crucial pillar that saves the state billions annually. Yet time and time again, they themselves do not receive the support that they need and that they rightly deserve. Of those 500,000 family carers across this country who give this state so much and those they love so much with unpaid hours of care, their asks pale into insignificance compared to the caring that they input. Now, the carers that I speak to across Longford and Westmeath tell me that they are made to feel guilty by needing respite hours, knowing that they themselves are physically and mentally burning out. They tell me that they feel their commitment to the care receiver is being taken advantage of by the state because despite those savings their care results in, their asks are very rarely, if ever, met in a timely fashion. They tell me that the interaction with the HSE and state agencies is far from a two-way street. Access to residential care has fallen since 2008, failing to not only keep up with population growth, but resulting in a shortfall between 800 and 2,300 places. Now, we know how vitally important this service is in terms of that temporary break, reducing stress, preventing burnout, and also tackling these feelings of isolation and loneliness that carers will experience, and the benefits to those who receive care also. And I have to comment, Minister, on the content of your speech just now, where you at pains highlight the difficulties that are facing, the increased number of children and adults who seek respite, access to respite. Minister, we have got a census. They have been around for a long time. That is an abdication of responsibility and an admittance of failure in your ability to plan. So too is the level of complexity. Again, that information is freely available. It just needs to be acted on. An increase in the age of people with a disability. It is not those who are in need of respite who are the cause of this issue. This issue was caused by successive governments being incapable of planning. 𝐥𝐢𝐬𝐭𝐞𝐧𝐢𝐧𝐠, it is past time that the state not only recognised the value of carers, but valued it, and valued it with meaningful supports when they need it.
Cairn, I've raised the issue of respite services for children in Cavan and Monaghan on several occasions, and it's the most frustrating issue that I ever have to deal with. But my frustration, of course, is nothing compared to the families that are affected by the systemic failure to provide their children with the respite services they need. On the 15th of February last, I had a debate with the Minister for Disabilities, and in that debate I highlighted the fact that there were no respite services at all for children in County Monaghan, and that the Cavan service is extremely limited, operating just every second week, oversubscribed, and that the admission policy discriminated against children in my constituency who couldn't get respite that they would if they lived elsewhere. And I raised the case of one family whose son has complicated disabilities and profound behavioural and other issues, and the family are going through a horrendous time. The child's father has been hospitalised since last year and will need long-term care. The mother's trying to hold all of these strings together, and if she unravels, then the whole family will unravel. The child needs respite, and his family desperately need him to get respite. And I thank the Minister Rabbitte for her proactive engagement with me on this case. But the child still hasn't got the respite he needs. The statement of purpose has been changed at Cavan, but this child still hasn't been offered respite. Efforts to secure a place in County Louth have not materialised. The family are now trying to source a service in County Kildare. County Kildare, from the top end of North County Monaghan. The very fact that the family are contemplating that just shows the desperation that is involved, and it's not good enough. It is a shameful indictment of our services for children with disabilities and every government that has allowed it to get to this point. Minister, this child's father is going to be released from hospital on the 16th of June, needing full-time care. I cannot, and I hope you will not, tolerate a situation where this mother is expected to care for two people on a full-time basis with no support at all from the people who are paid to help her. I commend Deputy Tully for bringing this motion here tonight, but I have to say, we all demand that it's actually acted upon for this family and for all families with children with disabilities that deserve much better than they're currently receiving from the HSE and this government.
Deputy Crowe.
Margaret, I think we all have cases that we could outline to you, Minister, and the reality is that many of the families are feel burnt out. I think it was timely that there was a submission there, pre-budget submission there today from MS Society of Ireland, and again they talk in terms of their submission there that they're looking for an increase in annual statutory investment in a centre there for people with MS and right across the board. I suppose there's common agreement, Ministers, in relation to that we're not doing enough. So I suppose the question that we need to ask is, why are we not doing enough? What are causing the blockages? We have an opportunity coming up with the next budget, but families are saying that they're burnt out. There's a survey in this leaflet that was given out by the MS Ireland. They're saying that 64% are emotionally drained, 32% experienced depression, and 22% have lost a job due to caregiving responsibility. That's not acceptable in the Ireland that we live in, and we need to do more. So what can we do? I suppose what people say to me is that respite for them is not just, it's life-saving, it's life-changing, and that's so. If we really believe that that's the case, why are we not doing more? So, Minister, we need to if it's a case of needing support, the support right across this House in relation to the rollouts of service. So why are we not doing enough? I remember when the closure of 𝐥𝐢𝐬𝐭𝐞𝐧𝐢𝐬𝐧𝐠 in Roscommon came about, and so many centres like that have closed over the years. But again, there was cross-party support in relation to it, but it went ahead and was closed. It's now a centre for refugees. So we need to be doing more for these families. It's not acceptable that the Minister go in and talk in terms of, you know, the challenges that we're facing. We want to hear what we're actually going to do, and we need to start delivering for these families. According to, I'll just finish by saying that the Irish state is supposed to be estimated to have saved 20 billion on an annual basis due to the 500,000 family carers that provide unpaid care each day to those living with disability or illness. Ministers, we need to do more.
𝐥𝐢𝐬𝐭𝐞𝐧𝐢𝐬𝐿. First of all, I want to thank Deputy Tully for bringing this motion to the floor tonight. Carers work all year round. They don't get holidays and are not entitled to holidays, according to Family Carers Ireland. We spoke on this morning in the Autism Committee, and it raised that families that have a family member with autism have additional costs, and it works out on an average of €244 a week, or €11,700 a year of additional costs. It was mentioned here already that they're looking for a national audit of respite services, because we don't know actually how many beds are in the country. And the worrying thing as well from Family Carers Ireland was the fact that over 50% of carers suffer with their mental health. I just want to touch on, while we're talking about respite and stuff, there was a meeting on Wednesday, February the 8th, with the HSC executive and board members of the 𝐥𝐢𝐬𝐭𝐞𝐧𝐢𝐬𝐧𝐠. Minister, you'll be familiar with it. But the startling thing about it, we've lost 22 beds down there in Middleton, and the associated services with it, while we're talking about respite services here. Now, I've raised this with the Commissioner on Human Rights, and I've also raised it with the European Ombudsman. But I have minutes from a meeting, and I'd like to quote him here. 𝐥𝐢𝐬𝐭𝐞𝐧𝐢𝐬𝐴 says, "The committee raised concerns regarding placements at St Stephen's Hospital, Glanmire, and St Catherine's Ward, St Finbarr's Hospital, Cork, as these centres had received lower Mental Health Commission inspection compliance ratings than the 𝐿 Centre. Concerns were expressed that these environments are congregated settings that are campus-based, isolated, away from community, in contravention of the Convention on Human Rights for Persons with Disabilities, government policy, and HSC policy, which is set out in the Time to Move On from Congregated Settings, a strategy for community inclusion." Now, we've been raising this in the issue of respite beds. It goes on to say in this meeting, it says, "Some members of the committee expressed dissatisfaction with the need to transfer the residents away from the Middleton area contrary to their expressed wishes." So there's a bigger picture here when we're on about services, losing beds, and I think this is a very timely motion. And I do admire what you're doing, Minister, and what you're trying to do. But I just wanted to flag it up with you, because it's like everything. If we're being misinformed, or you're being misinformed, if you're not getting the right information, you can't do the right job. Thank you.
Minister, I had a mother contact my office this month. She was at breaking point. She is a single mother. She had two sons, aged 17 and 14, who both have profound intellectual disabilities. She had not had respite since before the pandemic. She thinks that December 2019 was the last time that she got a break. That's 3.5 years ago. That is absolutely scandalous, Minister. 3.5 years without a break. And she and her two boys are suffering as a result of the failures of this government. Respite was the only thing keeping her going, and naturally she is finding this incredibly tough. Many of these people that we're talking about this motion are just incredibly selfless. They are the very best of people. They make huge sacrifices for their loved ones with minimum fuss. We often talk of unsung heroes in this House. By and large, many of these people are not looking for any great song and dance. They just want a rest. They just want respite. Is that so much to ask? It shouldn't be. In Cork, overnight respite services for children under age 18 with an intellectual disability, physical disability or autism is delivered by a range of organisations that you listed yourself a few minutes ago. The HSE stated in a PQ response to my colleague Thomas Gould that there's a total of 27 beds in Cork. However, 10 of those beds are suppressed and suspended due to staffing shortages. Now, you've addressed that you have been in contact with the authorities in Cork We will have to wait and see. I hope that that is resolved, but it is absolutely scandalous that there are 10 beds going abating. And I'm glad you agree with that, Minister, but it is absolutely scandalous. In the same response, we're told that the 𝐥𝐢𝐬𝐭𝐞𝐧𝐢𝐬𝐬 Cork Kerry Community Healthcare Disability Services received its letter of allocation of new funding under the Service Plan 2023, and it is less for CHO4. It is less than 50% of the usual annual development funding to CHO4 for respite, and no funding for residential respite. So on top of the reduction in beds, fundamentally we are talking about less funding for CHO4. So, Minister, as far as I'm concerned, that's pure and utter madness. Additional funding needs to be made available for additional respite facilities and respite nights to meet the growing demand for respite. You've given the example of the families in 𝐥𝐢𝐬𝐭𝐞𝐧𝐢𝐬𝐭 Special School, and that is, I'm glad you've addressed that, but there are many others who need it as well. So we need to address the funding and the beds.
Minister, I want to first of all welcome the fact that the government's not opposing the motion. Because, I mean, respite services, and you've acknowledged this, they're not receiving the support they need and rightfully deserve. And, I mean, the vital service, it must be funded adequately. So you must ensure that all respite services are brought back initially to pre-pandemic level and maintain existing capacity in the sector and prevent further closures like we're seeing in Donegal and Cork and Wexford. And I know both you and Minister Butler referred to alternative types of respite. And I mean, some of it I know is home-based, and it obviously is to do with what suits the person who requires the respite and the family. But I was talking to a family as well who have been given a grant. Now, I don't know if it comes under the respite title, but it's definitely a home support grant for their teenager. And they are given a grant where they look for the person and they pay them. The amount of money they can pay per hour is only $13.88, and they said they cannot find people to work for that level of pay. You know, and they're telling me the HSE give them this grant, but they're finding it impossible to get the people. So while they appreciate the grant and they appreciate the hours, they just aren't able to find people to work for that level of pay. And I mean, I suppose the Disability Capacity Review identified major shortages in respite services for adults and children. It notes that fewer than 1 in 4 parents caring for an adult or child with disability receive any form of respite. And it also recognised latent unmet need could be considerably higher than what is recorded, and that there is a potential need for approximately 20,000 additional respite hours. And I suppose the word there is potential, because we don't know, and as Deputy Collins referred there to what Family Carers Ireland said at the Autism Committee today, there's no audit of what the respite requirements we have. And they were suggesting would it be possible maybe to have a register where family carers could register if they required respite and give the details then of the person who's requiring the respite, so whether it's an adult or a child and what their needs are. I'm not sure if that's something that could be done, but it has to be very difficult to plan a service when you don't know actually what the need is. So I think that needs to be addressed. Now, you referred to it as well that sometimes residential beds respite beds are lost because somebody requires emergency residential long-term. Sorry.
Chair, that's the answer for Stranor. I can't pronounce it. Deputy Doherty's area.
Stranorlar.
Yes.
Yes.
That's the answer to that. 4 beds there.
Okay. But again, like, it's a chicken and egg, because if they were getting the regular respite, they might not need the residential as quickly as that, you know, for younger people anyway. And I've heard of quite a number of young people, teenagers, going into residential care. It's because they've not got the supports in the community, they've not got the respite, and then they end up needing residential. And I suppose it's linked to independent living anyway, because we know people are entitled to independent living under the UNCRPD. And again, there's a deficit there. And I'm hearing from the council where people are languishing on waiting lists, that they won't provide the housing until the HSE say that the support is there to support the person to live independently. And then you hear vice versa, the other way around. Now, I'm hoping that the National Strategy for Housing for Disabled People will address that. Certainly, Minister O'Donnell said that it would, and that the publication of that was imminent. Again, I asked him about that a few weeks ago. He said it was within a few weeks. So hopefully we will see that, and it will address some of the issues. I mean, I suppose Sinn Féin has committed to, in previous alternative budgets, to implement the recommendations of the Disability Capacity Review. Like, it's almost 2 years since the review was published, and there's still no implementation action plan for the capacity review. So we need to see that. We also consistently call on the government to develop a cross-departmental strategic workforce development plan to train and recruit and retain enough health and social care professionals. Again, I'm hearing that Minister Harris would have said that his department's only engaged in discussions around this with the HSE or with the Department of Health. Like, they've only been approached to discuss this. I mean, Progressing Disabilities was planned from 2014. It was known then that we were going to need all the staff. Even, I remember talking to managers of what were known as the child development teams before the CDNTs were formed, and they were saying there were waiting lists then. What did we think that was going to happen, you know, if the structure changed? There were still going to be waiting lists. And then, you know, it took some time to put the model in place, and that ended up lengthening those waiting lists as well. So I suppose I just feel, you know, it's time to give families a break and provide vital respite services. And so our motion is urging you to work with the stakeholders, to work with service providers in the sector, and to leverage all existing capacity in the sector and support the reopening of closed respite centres, and to implement a multi-annual strategic workforce plan. Thank you.